Do you like to play Magic the Gathering? Do you like it when your opponents don't play Magic the Gathering? Then you will love playing Stax in Commander. Stax is a strategy and playstyle that operates differently than traditional Magic decks. Resource denial is key, making it so your opponents are unable to play their cards. Today we'll be covering where Stax comes from, critical cards when brewing a deck, how to play it, how to play against it, and hopefully how to beat it. And you know we got those secret Commander decks that can take out a Stax player. Stax has been an established archetype since the early 2000s. It started in the Type 1 format now known as Vintage, and still sees play in both competitive and non-competitive settings. Stax is often frowned upon in casual play of Commander, but that doesn't stop players from bringing their taboo decks to Friday Night Magic. The stigma around Stax with casual players is often related to the idea of I just want to play my cards, because Stax is trying to stop just that. It's when you move into competitive settings both inside and outside of Commander where Stax becomes somewhat more socially acceptable. Just like in Legacy and Vintage, competitive EDH decks can win turn 1 or turn 2. It doesn't mean they will, but they are able to. So at a setting like that, Stax makes much more sense. With that type of power on board, Stax honestly feels a bit more fair than cheating out bonkers combos at somebody's upkeep. In casual Commander, players just want to play their cards. And in a pod where decks power levels are at a 7, Stax usually means lengthening the games to a point where it just feels stale. Now infinite combos are a bit more socially acceptable because the players can at least shuffle up and play another game, after probably telling that winning player to switch their damn deck. Speaking of salt, I want to clarify that Stax is a bit taboo in most casual settings. I don't advise bringing a Stax deck to your pod unless you've had a conversation beforehand. However, if you do, that's your business, go off king. This video is broken down into 3 parts: the history of Stax, how to play Stax and actually win, and lastly, how to play against Stax and hopefully stop them. You'll learn the very interesting history of Stax and why it became a viable strategy to begin with. Then we'll look at some signpost cards that help showcase the mindset on how to play a Stax deck. This video is perfect for the casual player wanting to lean into more competitive play. Or perhaps you don't want to play competitively at all and you're just Stax curious. Or maybe you want to show up to random LGS tables and make little children cry. You freak. We'll also look at how Stax actually wins. Lastly, we'll look at how to play against Stax, because we all know that person at the LGS who brings Stax decks to the casual pods. We'll break down how to proactively deal with these players and hopefully get rid of them. Buckle up and let's get them Stax. So what the hell is Stax? Stax was originally called Stax, written like this, which stood for the $4,000 solution. This was in the format Type 1, now known as Vintage. The name was a double entendre for the key card Smokestack. The $4,000 part was in reference to the price, given it was running almost all of the Power 9. Nowadays that's closer to $400,000 and not $4,000. Perhaps $4 million depending on the condition you're buying them in. The solution this deck was providing was one that slowed down the fast combo decks and the very popular Agro control deck Groatog. One mechanic it was specifically trying to deal with was the Storm mechanic from the Scourge set. This is where we see bonkers combos around Tendrils of Agony that leverage the classic card Burning Wish. Other famous Commander Stax decks include the now banned Commander Braid's Cabal Minion, and more recently in competitive EDH, Winota, featuring obviously Winota Joiner of Forces. Stax decks in Commander are optimized to restrict our opponent's resources and the ability to play their cards. And even though most of the cards that do this also affect us, our decks are optimized to play through them without much of any interruption. A very important callout is that Stax is defined differently in various Magic spaces. Originally in Legacy and Vintage formats, Stax was considered a Prison-style deck, not the other way around. Stax focusing on mana denial where Prison was about locking out players altogether. But today, the term Stax in Commander has evolved to be a bit of a catch-all for general Prison effects, land destruction, mana denial, OG Stax, and hate bears. And we'll talk about some of those terms soon. But in its simplest form, Stax is a control deck, but not the blue-white control deck that most players think about. Stax is an aggressive control strategy, meaning it's proactive and not reactive. The classic blue-white control decks use cards like Force of Will or Swords to Plowshares. That type of control deck is okay with you playing your cards, while Stax would probably prefer you don't play them at all. And when you do, it's probably too late to make a difference anyway. For example, let's pretend I play after my opponent. It's turn 1 and I play a Ragavan. If my opponent is playing a classic blue-white control deck, they can decide if they want to use Force of Will to counter my strong turn 1 Ragavan. Or perhaps they wait to use the Swords of Plowshares to deal with it at a later time. This allows the reactive control player to access threat levels and perhaps use the Force of Will on a card that isn't a creature. Plenty of time to react and make calculated decisions. Now Stax, being proactive, ideally played out a Chalice of the Void with 1 charge counter on it. My Stax opponent is being proactive and knowing I'll likely need to play a card with 1 mana value on my turn 1. And this just locked out my deck from playing any critical 1 mana cards that I needed to function. And since my opponent's threats all start at 3 mana, they're about to introduce me to their beatdown while I attempt to get a plan together to get my deck back on track. Speaking of, before we get too deep, let's talk about the original terms of Stax, Prison, and Pillow Fort. And remember that most of these were dated before Commander started to lump them together. And in this video, to simplify, I am also going to lump a lot of these terms together, but will highlight appropriate cards for the right themes. Stax is often referring to a strategy or a card that looks to slow down, tax, or restrain a player and their resources, especially mana. Stax was originally seen as a prison-style deck, not vice versa. With Stax, players often think of the color white or blue. A key Stax card is the creature Thalia, Garden of Thraben, a 2/1 creature for 1 generic and 1 white. The important ability here being non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast. You want to play your spells? Well, it will cost you more. And while you're set back a turn, I'll keep hitting you with Thalia. Classic Stax. Prison often refers to a strategy that wants to completely lock out their opponents. Players often think of the color red or colorless, or what they used to call mono brown given the color of the artifact cards. A key prison card here is Cursed Totem, a 3-drop colorless artifact. It reads, activated abilities of creatures can't be activated. Have fun with all your expensive vanilla creatures. And lastly, Pillow Fort refers to a strategy that stops opponents from hitting you. In a 4-person game, this often removes you from being hit by other players while you assemble your win cons. Some may even call them silly win cons. This strategy is seen as more fun in casual play because you're not stopping your opponents from playing their cards. Sometimes Pillow Fort does use Group Hug and even give players more resources. Resources that will eventually be used against them, but it's not stopping those players playing their cards. That's unless they're combining stacks into the mix. A key Pillow Fort card here is Propaganda, an enchantment for 2 generic and 1 blue. It reads, creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 generic for each creature they control that's attacking you. In casual Commander, usually people don't want to waste their resources to hit you, so this is often the first pillow that you want when making your fort. Pillow Fort is not remotely good in competitive settings, and I would know because I've played a lot of it, though I'm sure somebody somewhere has won a tournament while playing Pillow Fort. In this wide world of Magic, it's absolutely possible. Now, speaking of winning, if you want to win my heart, please like and subscribe. Now let's talk about how to play Stax in Commander. The cards we're about to review are all used as examples of playing Stax in Commander, yet not required for every single deck. These cards present a good overall primer on playing Stax, but again are not mandatory. The best cards for your deck all depend on many variables, including your commander, synergies, colors, and deck goals. Now, as a reminder, Stax is control, aggressive control, being proactive, not reactive. And we're doing this mainly with our permanents, artifacts, enchantments, and creatures. When Stax is mentioned, a few cards come to mind, usually artifacts. Our artifacts are one of the most critical card types in our Stax deck. First, there's the obvious namesake artifact, Smokestack, a 4-drop artifact that reads, at the beginning of your upkeep, you may put a soot counter on Smokestack. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player sacrifices a permanent for each soot counter on Smokestack. This card will hurt you unless you set it up accordingly. Having permanents that want to go to your graveyard like dredge cards, having an engine that generates tokens, or being able to loop lands with cards like Crucible of Worlds. Remember that the soot counters are may, so you can tick this up as you see fit. But once that decision is made, everyone, including yourself, has to live with the consequences until the card is removed. Next up is Thorn of Amethyst. It works great for us, but not likely for our 3 opponents. A 2-drop artifact that reads, non-creature spells cost 1 generic more to cast. This makes it harder for most decks to play to their curve. It especially hurts Spellslinger decks and makes it more expensive for our opponents to cast their artifact removal, targeting our cards. Another great artifact is God Pharaoh's Statue, a 6-drop that reads, spells your opponent's cast cost 2 more to cast, and at the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses 1 life. This is great because it slows down our opponents without messing up our plans. Then there's Ensnaring Bridge, a 3-drop artifact that reads, creatures with power greater than the number of cards in your hand cannot attack. This is helpful when our creatures are small and our opponent's creatures are big and dumb, or if our win con does not utilize combat damage. Given you'll see more than a few big dumb creatures at any given Friday Night Magic, this can be perfect to slow down the big stompy decks. Another deck type you might see, which is my personal favorite, is Graveyard and Reanimator decks. That's where a card like Grafdigger's Cage comes in handy. A 1-drop artifact that reads, creature cards in graveyards and libraries can't enter the battlefield. Players can't cast spells from graveyards or libraries. This can also be helpful against the card Natural Order. If you're running targeted hate like this, it's probably important that you also have the land Urza Saga in your deck, an amazing utility enchantment land that can tutor a 0 or a 1-drop artifact for free on its last chapter. What's amazing about this card is that if you have it in your opening hand, you have until turn 3 to assess what card in your toolbox will likely be most beneficial given the board state. Now, more in the Pillow Fort camp, but still amazing in Stax, are cards like Nord's Annex and Crawl Space. Given you'll likely be the target of your opponents, these cards help slow down their ability to hit you. Next up is Old Reliable Winter Orb, a 2-drop artifact that reads as long as Winter Orb is untapped, players cannot untap more than one land during their untapped steps. The way we make this work in our favor is to not rely as much on lands and instead have more emphasis on artifact mana like mana rocks or treasure tokens, or have ways to untap lands. Next, we have the important card type Enchantment. In Commander, this is perhaps where most of the key Stax components of your deck will arise. First, let's talk about everyone's favorite enchantment to hate, Blood Moon. Unless your opponents are running a monocolored deck, they'll likely groan when seeing this card hit the battlefield. An enchantment for 2 generic and 1 red, it simply reads non-basic lands are mountains. If you're playing against this card and you have fetches out, it's critical to respond with it on the stack and go fetch yourself some basic lands. Or else those fetches don't fetch anymore and are just tapping for red mana. Slowing down your opponent's mana production is critical when playing Stax and Commander, but our decks are still optimized to perform through these harsh environments that we set up. Like with the nasty card Price of Glory, an enchantment for 2 generic and 1 red. Whenever a player taps a land for mana, if it's not that player's turn, destroy that land. This card doesn't affect us as much, given we're not looking to play many spells on our opponent's turns, or again if we're running artifact mana or indestructible lands. Arguably this does fall into the land destruction theme, but Commander Stax often dips into that theme as well. And for all you blue players out there, there's Back to Basics, which sounds like the name of some crappy generic pop song. An enchantment for 2 generic and 1 blue that reads, non-basic lands don't untap during their controller's untap steps. This hurts so many decks that require dual lands and utility lands to function. It's important that you don't play this unless your deck is optimized to perform with basics, such as with a monocolored deck, or a duo deck that runs plenty of basics. And I mean plenty. Stax often takes popular trends like multicolored commanders and hates against them. Stax can rely on most opponents to play a bunch of non-basic lands, at least to the point where it hurts them more than it hurts us. Then we have Deafening Silence, an enchantment for 1 white. It reads, each player can't cast more than 1 non-creature spell each turn. Now this is perfect for a heavy creature deck, but also won't slow down other heavy creature decks. Similar enchantments are Rule of Law and High Noon. Great if you're playing against a deck that cheats things into play rather than cast them. Now what would a Stax video be without Stasis? Perhaps one of the most dreaded cards in all of the game. Stasis is an enchantment for 1 generic and 1 blue. Players skip their untapped steps. At the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice Stasis unless you pay 1 blue. You best know what you're doing with this card or you'll potentially lock out everybody, including yourself, creating a stalemate. And if you're wondering which decks would this actually be good in, great question. With a commander that offers the ability to untap permanents or blink them, like Brago, King Eternal, or Jorn, God of Winter. Some extra hate pieces are Solemnity for slowing down decks relying on counters being put on permanents, which can also lock out the game when you pair it with the card Decree of Silence, noting that it locks out the game in your favor. Rest in Peace and Leyline of the Void for shutting down graveyard and recursion decks, and some extra Pillowfort pieces that can pair well in a Stax deck, like with Ghostly Prison and Propaganda. Tax your opponents when they want to attack you with their creatures. Now speaking of creatures, let's take a look at the Stax All-Stars. Drana and Linvala. Great Stax commander, but is also amazing as a creature in any deck that it can be in. It's a 3/4 creature for 1 generic, 2 white, and 1 black. It has flying, vigilance. It states activated abilities of creatures your opponents control cannot be activated, and it has all activated abilities of all creatures your opponents control. You may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to activate those abilities. In the right pod, this card is outright nasty. Truly an oppressive card. Then there's Grand Abolisher. Just saying the name brings back trauma. A 2/2 creature for 2 white. It reads, during your turn, your opponents can't cast spells or activate abilities of artifacts, creatures, or enchantments. This allows you to get away with murder on your turns. There will be no stopping you. Well, at least on your turn. Fate Spinner is a 1/2 creature for 1 generic and 2 blue. It reads, at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, that player chooses draw step, main phase, or combat phase. The player skips each instance of the chosen step or phase this turn. This card greatly slows down your opponents. Godok Teed, also a great Stax commander, is a 2/2 creature for 1 green and 1 white. Non-creature spells with mana value 4 or greater cannot be cast. Non-creature spells with X in their mana cost can't be cast. A pain in the ass for your opponents if they are not prepared. Since your deck is optimized with creatures, all will be fine once Teakster here hits the battlefield. Magus of the Moon is essentially Blood Moon on a stick. Given it's a 2/2 creature, it's much more susceptible to removal though. Thalia Heretic Cathar is a 3/2 creature for 2 generic and 1 white. She has First Strike, and creatures and non-basic lands your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. Let's just keep our opponents opponents one turn behind forever. Then there's Grand Arbiter Augustine IV, another great Stax commander, and is another taxing creature. A 2/3 creature for 2 generic, 1 white and 1 blue. It reads, white spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Blue spells you cast cost 1 less generic to cast. Spells your opponents cast cost 1 more to cast. There are only 2 things certain when playing against Stax and Commander:
death and taxes.
Now, lands in Commander stack decks are not as critical as they are in, say, Legacy or Vintage, and that's mainly due to the fact that Commander is a singleton format with 3 opponents instead of 1. Using a card like Rashadan Port to tap down one opponent's land doesn't really become helpful when you have 3 opponents, but depending on the deck, you can still make use of utility lands in Commander stacks. Like I stated before, Urza's Saga is a great way to tutor up a 0 or 1 drop artifact for targeted hate like Graveyard. Maze of Ith can also help slow down problematic attackers, but in Commander we only get 1 of these lands each, which means lands don't become as critical and definitely not as consistent as in formats that can have 4 copies. However, green decks do have access to land tutor, so that can help in a pinch. A helpful strategy can be to loop targeted land destruction cards like Wasteland or Strip Mine. This is possible by artifacts like Crucible of Worlds or sorceries like Light from the Loam, but the outcome better be good, or we better be able to play an extra land per turn, because we are restricting our own resources when we use cards like Wasteland or Strip Mine. Now, this is all great, but how does Stax actually win in Commander? This boils down to you building a strategic win con that still performs well under the brutal conditions that you've now created. I saw this hilarious Reddit post that defined it as this: think of piloting a Stax deck like a tractor. It is slower than cars, but since all your deck does is throw rocks and pitfalls, you move slowly and steadily through the obstacles while others have to stop and remove them. And that is exactly correct. Build a strategy that hurts a high percentage of decks but allows us to navigate with ease. For example, if Teakster here is your commander, you are going all in on creatures to win. If Aloro is your commander and you're gaining a ton of life, it will likely be Aetherflux Reservoir while you take out players one by one with your huge life total. Or like we said with Brago, King Eternal, lock your opponents out with Stasis, and you'll more or less have infinite combat turns depending on the board state. So regardless if you are playing Stax or not, how do you win against it? In casual Commander, most decks are not set up to deal with Stax, which in that case, you'll likely need to do what feels natural: politic your group to remove the problem. And if you're the one playing Stax in this situation, be prepared to deal with just that: a ton of politics against you. But if you're looking for decks that perform well against Stax, you'll need to be specific on who you're up against. But generally, Kali of the Vast is a great option against Stax due to the ability to not need mana to play out our creatures. Whenever Kali of the Vast attacks an opponent, you may put an angel, demon, or dragon creature card from your hand into the battlefield tapped and attacking that opponent. No mana, no worries. Or another good option is Jory of the Gitu. Pay 2 generic, exile a non-land card from your hand, put 4 time counters on the exiled card. If it doesn't have suspend, it gains suspend. Stax is slowing down the game. 4 turns will go by plenty fast once Stax locks out the board. Just make sure to use your mana wisely here. Marie can be good given it has a ton of ways to untap creatures. But if you're not wanting to change your commander, then just find some specific cards that will hopefully stop your opponents when playing Stax. Finding combo, artifact, and enchantment hate will likely be your best bet here because that's what Stax relies on. There are spot removal pieces like Crow's and Grip, Naturalize, Boseiju Who Endures, or Force of Vigor. All of these can take out both artifacts and enchantments. Green is clearly the best color to do this. A card like Abrade or Destroy Evil is spot removal for artifacts, while Vandal Blast has Overload and can destroy all artifacts that are not yours. Feed the Swarm is the best mono black enchantment removal by far. Now Farewell will pretty much exile any non-land permanent you need it to deal with. Plus it's dealer's choice on this one, as you get to decide how many of these card types you are exiling. And yes, it can be all of them. A fun one is also Serenity because it's a ticking time bomb. However, even though it is fun to watch your opponent sweat, it is subject to being removed by that Stax player. Now you're all ready to play Stax. Or now that you've studied the enemy, you're ready to play against Stax. I hope that you found all of this information helpful in your journey to locking down your opponent's board states. Is there a Stax commander that you enjoy playing the most? Or perhaps one that you're most excited to build? And most importantly, let me know in the comments which theme, type, or color you want me to focus on next. I'm Nicplz, thank you for joining me.